Hi everybody. Today I would like to show you my personal all-time favorite method how to tune a guitar by ear. This method works extremely well with acoustic instruments of any kind. It is probably not the perfect method for a beginner because you need to have a pretty good ear to hear if an interval is in tune or sounds pleasant to your ear or if it is slightly out of tune. It is probably also not suited for tuning in an extremely noisy environment. So if you're sitting in a bar and the crowd is going crazy, you should rather rely on a tuner. I learned this method from a classical guitar player several years ago, and I refer to it as the piano way of tuning a guitar. Why? It's very simple. It is very similar to the way you would tune a piano or a grand piano. Pianos and grand pianos are usually not tuned with tuners, but entirely with the ear, because you have to find the compromise which gives you the best balance and makes the whole instrument over the whole range of notes sound in tune. This method is actually extremely simple to use. The only tricky part is you need to use your ears to decide if the intervals sound pleasant to your ears, and then you have to find a balance that all intervals sort of sound as good as they possibly can. It is of course important that the instrument is set up perfectly, that the saddle is right, that the intonation is right, but this method even works with instruments which can't be set up perfectly. I had a couple of old historic instruments where you just don't want to mess with anything and you want to use them on a recording, and this method just works fine in order to find a balance that the instrument sounds as close to perfect as possible. So when you watch that little tutorial today, just pay attention to my little notes and I will explain you on the way in between what I'm doing. Enjoy. I compare the well-tuned open A string to the G string fretted in the second fret. This note is an A and it is the octave to the open A string. When you watch that little clip now, pay attention that I slightly bend the G string in order to see how far off I am. Pay attention to the coloration which changes when you carefully bend the G string. It's a very good indicator exactly when the point is reached that both strings are perfectly in tune or that the interval you're listening to is as pleasant as it could possibly be. As soon as I think that the G string is in tune with the A string, I start playing different notes on the G string and compare them to the open A string. This gives me a good feel how different intervals sound between those two strings. I can now fine-tune the tuning of the G string in order to get the best tuning result, which is a compromise between those two strings. In case the string seems to be a little bit high, before you tune it down actually, try to pull it physically a little bit and see if this solves the problem. We will now compare the A string to the D string fretted in the 7th fret, which will again give us the octave up to the A string. We will now compare the open A string to different fretted notes on the D string to see how different intervals sound, so we can fine-tune the D string to get the best result for all intervals. We will now do the same thing with the open D string and the B string fretted in the 3rd fret, which will give us another D just an octave up. As soon as both strings seem to be in tune, we check the intervals. In the next little segment, I show you how to tune the high E string. We do this by playing the G string as an open string and fretting the high E string in the 3rd fret. This sequence is a little bit longer because in my first tuning effort, I shot a little bit high and was unsatisfied, so I go back, detune the E string again, and tune it a second time. I left this on purpose for you to see it and to get a feel for listening to the different intervals. The low E string is being tuned in a similar way. You play the open A string and fret the low E string in the 5th fret. As soon as they match, you start comparing the intervals. It is also a good idea at that point to compare intervals between the low E string and the other strings. I left this out because otherwise the video would have gotten too long, and I want to show you at the end how beautiful the guitar sounds by tuning it the way I just presented.